real pleasure and honor for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Katherine Ott. She is a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in the Division of Medicine and Science. She earned a bachelor's degree in media studies and mass communication from the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque, and a master's and PhD in American history at Temple University. Her research specialties include history of the body, disability, ethnic and folk medicine, integrative and alternative medicine, ophthalmology, plastic surgery and dermatology, medical technology, prosthetics and rehabilitation, gender and sexuality. As noted in the bio for today's program that Katherine shared, she has spent 20 plus years thinking, talking, and writing about how and why people in the past were tagged for being different because of disease, gender, disability, sexuality, race, or, I love this in quotes, just being annoying, unquote. She has led exhibitions on the history of HIV and AIDS, the Stonewall Anniversary, polio, which is near and dear to our Rotarian hearts, and disability in America, among other topics. She teaches a graduate course at the George Washington University and has authored or co-edited 3 books. Katherine responds to all pronouns and is energetically honing her queer superpower. So with that, let me bring up Katherine. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Monica. Monica is one of my most favoritist colleagues, I will say. And thank you, Madam President, and all of you, good afternoon, buenas tardes, aloha, those online. Hello, everyone. Happy Pride, happy Juneteenth +2, happy solstice. Thank you for inviting me over and for all of y'all to come hear this talk. I'm a longtime fan of Rotary. You helped us a lot with the polio history exhibition in 2025, I think, for the anniversary of the vaccine. And I deeply respect your commitment to service and the work that you do all around the world. I learned a lot about Rotary International back then, and I'm still a fan. In the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about LGBTQ plus collecting and history and how essential it is to move with the times. After all, history is actually about the future, not the past. Because when you think about it, everything that will be remembered about us and our time will be remembered in the future. And one of the questions that drives my work, and knowing what I know about Rotary, it drives your work too, is what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And it's kind of a philosophical question, and it's not really meant to be answered. It's more meant to be lived. And we all do that as best we can. So I'm going to use gay, queer, LGBTQ plus kind of interchangeably with the full knowledge that gender terms are inadequate. And by tomorrow, these are all going to be obsolete and probably offensive to many people. I mean, I myself answer to any and all pronouns. I've never been able to keep up with my own gender identity from day to day. So how can I expect someone else to do that? This is going to be a breezy tour of what we do at the National Museum of American History. Queer history through the stuff left behind, I guess. The Smithsonian has a trove of LGBTQ plus material all across the museums. All of the museums have materials. And as with much of the historical evidence of queer lives, collecting has often been unintentional and inadvertent. We collected not knowing more about the person. Our museum has been collecting queer materials since the beginning of the institution itself in 1829. I can say that with confidence because queer people, by whatever historical names, have been around forever, including James Smithson, by the way. That's a whole nother topic. And longer, of course, like our numismatics, our coin and money collection has queer monarchs on coins like Hadrian, Edward II, James I, William I, Queen Anne. And unfortunately, we can't identify all or even a fraction of the objects in our collections that relate to those gender non-conforming, gender expansive old maids, bachelors, Nellies, and their beards of the past. LGBTQ plus identity is not part of the provenance that's included in accession records. And I'm also mindful of the thousands and thousands of people who lived quietly and left us before we could claim them as ours or even misgender them if we tried to. So anyway, more on collections. We have muscle magazines, for example. Who knew they were queer, right? They were essential before the internet for young men and boys who were figuring themselves out. George Takei told me, he's the Star Trek guy. He told me that when he in LA was a young kid and he saw in some of the kiosks, those muscle magazines, let's say he was moved. It confirmed in him that he was different. They were essential for him. We have early important magazines like The Ladder, The One, Mattachine Review, and some of the other staples of the homophile movement. The homophile movement refers to the people in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s who came out and for their safety sought respectability, wearing straight clothes, trying to do straight behavior, if they could, trying to pass. And there were laws in those days until the 70s in many states that made you very arrestable if you were not wearing at least 3 articles of clothing that matched your gender, your biological gender. And if this were the 1960s, I could be arrested right now, just saying. The laws gave cover on bar raids and to grab people off the street if they were holding hands or if they were walking funny, they could be arrested. But we have quirky artifacts also, what I like to call the National Matchbook Collection. They're all from LA and around. Writing your phone number on a matchbook cover used to be a sexy kind of contact tracing, if you want to think of it that way. And now the bars are gone, nobody smokes, and you need a smartphone to find random sex, or so I'm told. I started at the museum about 25 years ago, and I've slowly been identifying and adding to the LGBTQ plus collections, and I do it as the history of sexuality, kind of a quaint category, I know, but since I wasn't hired to do that, my main job is history of medicine. That was the only way that I could justify documenting queer history to my supervisor, who is still there. I don't think he's online, but there was and still is internal politics and hesitancy around actively documenting LGBTQ plus history. You know, shocking, right? For a government agency to be wary of anything queer. Our objects represent familiar names like Frank Kameny that Monica mentioned, Jason Collins, the basketball player, Will and Grace, Billie Jean King, Ellen DeGeneres, Renee Richards, and familiar events like gay marriage, the various marches on Washington for lesbian and gay rights, HIV and AIDS, Supreme Court rulings, don't ask, don't tell, and also the regular people who live lives of difference, who may have had an interest in leather or body hair or flower arranging or protected, unprotected sex, child rearing, feminism, and of course, t-shirts and buttons. So many, all kinds of buttons. Anyone from San Francisco? Here, the San Francisco LGBTQ. Yeah, oh, good. So the Queer Museum there has over 3,000 t-shirts. and we're going to let them keep the dominance in t-shirt collecting. And I think it's a very North American thing to acquire buttons and t-shirts everywhere you go. And then after 5 years or so, try to get a museum to take them. It's like a ritual or something. There are, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, there were no gay buttons, but we have other things such as costumes from Bessie Bonehill, who impersonated men and boys, and she sang love songs to women on stage. She was a vaudeville star in the 1880s and 90s, and her most popular character was a rayfish, cocky male, often a sailor boy, even then. We also have costumes from Charlotte Cushman, who was born in 1816. She was much more famous. She was a Civil War spy. She had many lovers and she broke many hearts. She lived in Italy for a while in the artists' colony of sculptor Harriet Hosmer. The Portrait Gallery has some of her work. She played on stage Hamlet, Romeo, Cardinal Wolsey from the 1850s to the 70s, and her biographies describe her as a tomboy and having close friendships with women. Speaking of close friendships, we also have objects from President James Buchanan. He had a close friendship with William Rufus King, who was a senator and then vice president for about 6 weeks under Franklin Pierce, and then King died of tuberculosis. Buchanan and King shared a bed, and around Washington, people talked about them as a married couple. His niece burned his papers, and we know why that happened, right? And before you ask, no, we don't have anything from Stonewall. I don't think anyone does. Also, Stonewall was important, but only a blip in the long history of gay activism. It's kind of like a drop in the bucket, in my opinion, and it's kind of overrated. It's become famous for being famous, kind of like the Kardashians, you know, just gets perpetuated. When I've been challenged for collecting queer stuff, and why do you do that? Why are you using taxpayers' money for that? My answer varies with my mood, and also like how rude the questioner is, how much I can get away with, I think. But basically, it has to do with my responsibility as a professional historian and a public servant. And as for me personally, I think of queer collecting and queer history as kind of like jalapenos. Like whether you like them or not, they're still delicious. Some of you may know Attorney Paul Smith, who's local, has argued before the Supreme Court several cases where he donated the notebook that he used at the podium when he argued Lawrence v. Texas before the court back in 2003. He also gave us his lucky necktie. I think it's lucky. He didn't really identify it as his lucky necktie, but it's the tie he wore that day. And he was surprised when I asked when I said, what were you wearing? Can we have your necktie? And that was the case that overturned the 1968 Bowers v. Hardwick that had made sodomy or gay sex illegal. No matter if you were consenting, you were in your own bedroom, wherever, it was still illegal. And Lawrence v. Texas made it legal again. For HIV and AIDS, we have lab equipment, medications, lab equipment from Jay Levy's lab, who was one of the teams that identified the virus. We have bling and conference bags from international AIDS conferences, also buttons and t-shirts. A quilt panel for the AIDS quilt made by the really fabulous Gert McMullen, who made a panel for Roger Lyon with his famous quote, when he testified before Congress, quote, "Don't let my epitaph be that I died of red tape." And we got the panel when the quote was on the Mall in 1987. And to illustrate how times have changed, it was offered to the political history division, and they turned it down because HIV was just too political and controversial. They offered it to the medical history division, and we took it, before my time, but we took it as a health issue. Sidebar, one of the demands of the 1979, the first March on Washington, was to repeal all anti-LGBTQ plus laws. And bring us up to today, currently there are over 500 proposed new discriminatory laws in 40 states. So we do have anti-queer materials, we have gay conversion workbooks, hate ephemera, cure, so-called cure devices like electroconvulsive shock equipment, lobotomy knives. A large percentage of the people who were lobotomized were people who could not fit in because they were gender non-conforming. St. Elizabeth's in DC was one of the places where Freeman, the man who perfected, let's just say, lobotomy, transorbital lobotomy practiced. Many other repositories and cultural institutions document queer history. What is different for us at American History is that we also have objects. We have mostly objects, whereas our cousin queer cultural collecting institutions are primarily archives. No offense to archives, I love archives. But that's paper, photographs, the flat things. We have a lot of the three-dimensional things. And another difference is that we tell a larger, more interdisciplinary, more national story about everything. For example, with queer history, we do history of medicine, we do politics, immigration, we integrate queer history into those national stories, into the bigger context of race, of disability, because that's part of our mission, is to tell the wholeness of American history. In doing this work, to be sure, all of us are pushing back against society and how it defines normalcy, whether it's how much pigment you have in your skin, or how you behave, or how you speak, or if you don't speak, or who you love. And this history has not always been welcome or easy or even clear. There is no unified queer history anywhere. And especially for queers of color, the legacies of colonialism, of pillage, of racism and appropriation have derailed, even erased history of many people. And queer history is a messy, wrenching one of violence, of tragedy, of coping by finding love or using humor and irony. That nearly daily emotional jolt, there's the roller coaster of forward and backward throughout history of danger and joy. It's captured in two objects I want to tell you, the last two objects I'll tell you about. First one is a ring that Matthew Shepard bought because he was going to get married, even though it was illegal at the time. He was the young gay man brutally beaten and left for dead beside a field in Laramie, Wyoming in 1998. But he was a romantic and a dreamer, and he imagined that he would get married someday and have a family. His parents told me when they were cleaning out his apartment in Laramie, they had no idea that he had this ring. He was just saving it. He was waiting. And the other object is from John Waters, the filmmaker, artist, writer, Hairspray, the guy who wrote Hairspray. He's very irreverent. And So the backstory to what we collected is when I get interviewed from time to time about queer collecting, the journalists will say, so what is on your wish list? What is it you're dying to get? And it's not a question that I can really politically answer, because if I say one thing, I'll probably get sent in the mail lots of examples of it, or the person will be offended that I'm talking about them without them knowing. So I always used to say John Waters' mustache, because he has this pencil thin mustache. And I thought, impossible, no way. It's a good thing to mention. Well, I'm talking with him about collecting. He said, I have nothing left. Everything is going to Wesleyan, where there's a theater collection. I have nothing. And being John Waters, I said, well, you mean everything, even like your toenail clippings are donated? And it sparked his mind, and he said, I have something. So he gave us the Maybelline pencil he uses to highlight his mustache, and the pencil sharpener that has shavings in it from his sharpening. He also gave us like the empty La Mer jar that is very expensive cream. So if you ever come to the museum and you want to smell John Waters, I can open the jar for you. But being different in any way is always potentially dangerous, and being queer has its own unique perils. Youth are more at risk for suicide, violence, harassments, the denial of services and rights. And those who are transgender have to deal with an even more intense onslaught of misunderstanding, of threat and disrespect. But so in conclusion, I just want to say that this has been a quick look at what we're doing and why to document this history. But now I have to go revise my wish list and try to think of some other impossible thing to add to it. If you have any suggestions, let me know. But that's it for me.
I was asking if there are any exhibits that we want to rush down to see in the upcoming near future at the Museum of American History.
Well, so good question. All questions are good. And I know you're always supposed to answer a question by saying good question, but it was actually a good one in this case. Because it gives me a chance to promote what we're doing further. There's an exhibit that opened last fall called Entertainment Nation, and has a whole range of, including some queer examples of popular culture in it. So that there's that one. I'm working on an exhibit on medical history right now, which is contentious, let's just say, because it's looking at what people know from COVID and the systemic racism, the economic inequities, scapegoating, all of those things that are embedded in medical diagnosis, and we don't really understand the origins. But it's about the amazing, miraculous things that medicine does. At the same time, people are left out and harmed, which is a very fine line to walk. And included in that are some things about gender, about women's health. We also have at this point still, we haven't had anyone tell us to take it out. We have a mug that says, not only women menstruate, which makes people, what? How could that be? Because one of the things we want to do is shake people up and get them to think about the world has changed in the last 10 years for Gen Z and the changes that they're pushing on us. So there's that. Those are the two that we're also doing one that's in the works, hasn't been fully approved yet, called Science on Trial, which is about how scientific experts are understood in courts of law, and how the science has some issues with it sometimes. And included in a couple of the cases, we hope, there's one with a sexual assault kit that we recently collected, and that's a major issue in queer and disability communities. But so, yeah, there's a lot in the works and different levels of approval, because we are hand-wringing federal people who, oh, you can't say that. Who's going to get elected? And then what's going to happen? How will you get funding? And so, yeah, fun job, right? I know. Yes. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Max, and I live about a block and a half from Annie's. I eat there probably once or twice a week. Great place. But I have a couple of questions. Well, one question is, I didn't understand your phrase. You said gender conforming language. That's, can you talk a little bit more about that? And
Non-conforming.
yeah,
Yeah.
gender non-conforming.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so the other thing is, so what is the proper way to ask somebody, are you gay? Are you queer? Are you, or is it and my 22-year-old granddaughter said, Papa, you have no idea how to do that. So I need some help.
Yeah. So yeah, that's like such a complicated question. And so gender non-conforming is if you were assigned a biological gender or people see you as that, but that doesn't really fit who you are. Like I'll use myself as an example. I am biological female, but I've been a tomboy all my life. And I've been attracted to a range of people. So, and has not been acceptable, even though humans are everything. And in one human day to day, you may have an erotic response, not in the sense of sexuality, but just a sensory response to someone. You really like them. There's great chemistry, but because of our socialization and our etiquette, you have to shut that down because you'll be in trouble, you'll be in danger, you'll be excluded, whatever. And it's really difficult for many people to not want to smoke the whole pack, if you know what I mean, to like just act on it. And that can cause a lot of cognitive dissonance and depression, suicidal thoughts, mental illness, all kinds of things. It's a really difficult life if you grow up in a family where that's acceptable and then you go out in the world, it makes it really hard. And it's kind of different to be queer because unlike, say, you live in a family where everyone has the same skin color, hair texture, culturally the same, and you're taught the ropes in a way, but if you're queer, it's hard to find someone to teach you the ropes. So yeah, and with your granddaughter, I think the bottom line is respect. And it's not appropriate to ask like, well, A, are you gay? Or B, what do you do? That's like, we know you're not supposed to ask, what do you do? But now you have to get over it. Why does it matter to you is the question you should ask yourself before you ask somebody else. Why does it matter to you? Because you should respond to the person, to their gifts, to their talents, to whatever they're bringing. That's what you should pay attention to.
Thank you so much for your talk today. Can you, do you have any examples of pre-colonial America? And maybe can you talk about a little bit more about how that was perceived and talked about at the time?
Oh, yeah. So we don't know a whole lot because basically Europeans crushed the expressions of sexuality or the understanding of gender and sexuality to fit into the Judeo-Christian traditions. And this is true where the British went to India and outlawed hijra expressions, or in American Samoa, where there are fa'afafine, in North America and South America also, because it was threatening, it was not understandable, it was foreign. So let me think, a good example would be, well, fa'afafine is a good example. It took me a while to learn how to say that, by the way. So fa'afafine, it's in Samoa. So if a family has, and this is one of those instances where with indigenous practices, there are all kinds of places, or all kinds of places for you in your community. It has to do with the role that you play in the community, not with who you love or any of that. So, and there are no good translations. So that's why I can't just say Fa'afafine means. I have to explain this whole thing around it, the whole context. So if you grow up in a family that has all boys, you need someone to do those roles, those domestic roles. So you just pick a boy and you raise them as you would a wife or a mother or the domestic feminine, what we think of as feminine, which is not really the right word. And they may be straight. They may grow up and get married and have children, but still dress as a female because there's a place in traditional society for that, because the society needs to be strong, needs to continue. So they make room for a family that's like that and needs this. So that's the role. So that's Fa'afafine. And we have a shirt that we got from Ambassador Hubner, who was an out ambassador appointed by President Obama. And he and his husband were in Samoa and New Zealand. And the Fa'afafine gave him this shirt, which we now have in the collection, which is great because it made me learn how to say it and talk about it. And I see the time is up. So thank you. Okay.
And I don't know if you could stay after for a little bit. I know there was other questions. On behalf of the Rotary Club of Washington, D.C. and our Trees for the Capital program, I am pleased and proud to present you with this certificate signifying our commitment to plant a tree in your honor as